Milling Through History presents Dueling. When it comes to this rather unique form of fighting, dueling has certainly captured the imaginations of many people throughout the years. For some reason, it has a certain degree of romanticism placed around it. The principle of two people standing back to back, pacing out an agreed upon number of steps, turn and firing pistols at each other. And yet, for all the danger that it has, it's still something which people are always fascinated by. We have seen dramatizations of it occur in plays and musicals. We've even seen politicians say they wish they could challenge a person to a duel. And yet, for all of this, there seems to be a certain lack of understanding as to what it actually means to have been part of a duel. And so in today's episode, we actually look at the principle of dueling and why it is that for as much as we romanticize it today, society, for even longer, has attempted to do everything possible to get rid of it. Now, the origins of dueling is rather unique, as it goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, especially around the time of the Vikings. Now, the principle behind dueling, interestingly enough, was never to actually kill your opponent, but rather to restore the honor of the offended party by showing that they were willing to put their lives on the line just to prove an injustice. However, no sooner does this principle of fighting begin, attempts to end it occur just as quickly. One of the things that had evolved from this original just attempting to put your life on the line is that you would find that people would say, well, if God is on my side, then I shall be victorious, and I am willing to put my life on the line, and I will kill you just to prove the truth. By the time of the Renaissance, the church had begun to get involved with dueling by attempting to outlaw it at every turn they could get. As such, it became a rather unique situation, namely because if God is against the idea of man killing man, and yet they are willing to invoke the name of God to prove their innocence, how does one exactly get around this situation? Well, as soon as the Renaissance did roll around, the very first code of dueling, better known as the Code Duello, would make its first appearance in Italy. Now, one of the things that had occurred, though, is that to learn this particular code meant you were part of the upper class. And so only those who had the funds to purchase weapons that were meant specifically for dueling, or even to have the skill to fight a duel, would actually do it. For the common man, justice would still be found within some type of court system, or they would certainly try to take the law in their own hands, only to find themselves on the receiving end of justice from a court. Now, by the time of the 17th and 18th century, dueling with swords began to fall away. It didn't mean that this didn't occur still. It's just that what was seen as a more preferred method of dueling was through the use of pistols. Pistols allowed for a bit more even-handedness in the fight, mainly because if one person who was fighting a duel was actually very good at swordplay and the other person wasn't, it was an uneven fight. But with staring down the barrel of a pistol at your opponent, you had just as much chance of hitting him as he did of hitting you. Now, in both England and the United States, dueling was seen as a gentlemanly pursuit. And in order to ensure that dueling had a bit of what was considered legitimacy, but also an understanding of witnesses to the event, a second was added on to the duel. And this person would be there in the event the primary person was unable to fight, if they were wounded and the duel needed to continue, or alternatively, just someone there to act as a loader and hold on to all personal possessions. Now, throughout the 18th and 19th century, however, dueling was being frowned upon by many people. And this just wasn't also something that was found within the church. In fact, upper class society and lower class society began to look poorly upon dueling. Now, legally, the practice was deemed as murder, and so if you were part of a duel and your opponent died, you were criminally liable. However, the courts rarely prosecuted dueling, anyone involved with dueling itself, namely because the principle of restoring one's honor and being gentlemanly was still rather ingrained in it. And so if you started to prosecute one person for dueling, everyone would have to be prosecuted for dueling. And this is really where it became very, very tricky. But by the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century, dueling itself would find itself becoming less popular amongst different groups of people. For instance, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin both opposed. One of the last bastions of attempting to hold dueling as a principle was that of the American South. But interestingly enough, by the time of the Civil War, the term duel became just really a cover for any two individuals that had a grief with each other to go out and fight. And as such, the principle of honor and respectability had dramatically decreased. In fact, some have even argued that the Civil War itself was the death of this romanticized chivalric era where you had the gentleman who would fight for the honor of the lady. And so what last vestiges of it would occur throughout the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th century is really just the echoes of a bygone age. Now, by the latter half of the 19th century, though, dueling had fallen out of favor amongst pretty much all of society. Laws which had been put onto the book to dissuade dueling had been somewhat successful, but really it was society that was the one that put an end to the practice as a whole, namely because they saw dueling as an act of senseless killing and maiming, and thus the active decision to stop the practice was made. Now, a lot of it also stemmed from the fact that the most notable group of people who actually involved themselves with dueling came from, yes, the upper classes, but also the officer corps of many militaries. In fact, it was pointed out that in the British Navy, of the 10,000 duels that were fought, all 10,000 were done primarily from their officer corps, be it from their lieutenants to their commanders. Once you got to about the rank of captain, the need to fight a duel had pretty much gone to the wayside. You had enough knowledge and experience that said this was a bad idea. And so losing talented young men to this practice really helped to push along the idea that dueling was a bad idea. Now, in the United States, Congress even attempted to create a constitutional amendment to end dueling around the year 1840. However, the measure never passed. And while dueling itself would fall out of favor within the Western nations, it would actually not, it would be Uruguay that would be the country that would have the last and final duel ever officially recorded in 1971. And so this practice really has only been out of use for, for only about 50 years. Now, when it comes to the art of the duel, though, there are many rules attached to it, namely because one party has to offend another. And at that point, the offended party is the one that challenges the duel. And once the challenge has been made, it then goes to the challenged party. So this is the one that actually made offense to begin with. They dictate the terms of the duel, namely, what weapons will you use? And once that is decided, you would also fix an agreed upon date for this to occur. If there are to be witnesses, both sides must agree to the number of witnesses that would be had. And once they have the agreed upon place and time, then both sides will steer clear of each other until the appointed hour where they fight their duel. Now, we are not, of course, condoning the practice of dueling, but merely attempting to make sure the process is understood. But history itself does have a number of famous notable duels, the most notable of which, of course, is that of Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. The duel itself is very famous, but thanks to the musical Hamilton, more people now know more about it. And oftentimes, the famous line of, "I am not going to waste my shot," certainly comes into play there. Andrew Jackson, 7th President of the United States, fought 2 duels, with one of them leaving a bullet in his chest for the majority of his life. In fact, the bullet would not be removed until his presidency. James Bowie, famous for dying at the Alamo, is also famous for fighting a duel, specifically with a knife. The Bowie knife gets its name from this famous duel, as it was an extra large, extra wide knife that could cause a great deal of harm to anybody that would find themselves on the wrong end of it. Even Abraham Lincoln found himself challenged to a duel, but unlike our previous entries, Lincoln had friends who were able to come up with a way for both sides to agree that they weren't necessarily going to fight, but they could certainly find a way to come to an agreement on their differences. And finally, Mark Twain was challenged to a duel, but while Twain had no intention of fighting a duel, and his opponent did, it was Twain's second who gets the true notoriety credit here, namely because in discussing the terms of the duel with the opponent, Twain was described as being an excellent marksman, and that his skill with a gun could be unparalleled. Now, exactly what boasts were made is uncertain, but it was enough for the duel to be canceled, as Twain's opponent was convinced he might actually end up being killed instead of doing the killing. And while we here at Milling Through History once again condemn the practice of dueling and do not condone anyone from doing it, we have to say that the romanticism behind it is certainly something that may inspire you. But rest assured, being on the receiving end of a barrel of a pistol, standing at about 10 paces apart, is something that does not exactly always sound very fun. It's not as if we have any experience in that department whatsoever. For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. And we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.